My name is Cassandra Moreau, and 70 years ago, I learned that even immortal creatures can bleed, not in body, but in soul. They say that vampires are monsters who hunt in the darkness, predators without conscience or remorse. But what they don't tell you is that the real monsters aren't always the ones with fangs. Sometimes, they're the ones who wear beautiful faces and whisper promises of forever while they strip away everything that makes you human. I should know. I became one of them. But this isn't a story about becoming a vampire. This is a story about what happens after, about betrayal, redemption, and the impossible weight of eternity when you're forced to carry it alone. 70 years. That's how long I've existed in this form, suspended between life and death, watching the world turn while I remain frozen in the moment I died. But death, I discovered, is not always an ending. Sometimes it's a beginning you never asked for. His name was Dorian Blackwell, and he was the most beautiful lie I ever believed. I met him in the autumn of 1955 in a small cafe near the university where I was studying literature. I remember the way the golden afternoon light filtered through the windows, catching the dust particles in the air like tiny stars. I was 23 years old, full of dreams about the life I would build, the books I would write, the world I would explore. He sat down across from me without invitation, those dark eyes studying me with an intensity that should have warned me away. But I was young and foolish, and when he smiled, I felt like I'd been seen for the first time in my life. Dorian courted me with a patience that seemed endless. He would appear at the cafe every day at the same time, always with a new book to discuss, always with questions that made me think, made me feel clever and special. He never aged, but I didn't notice, or perhaps I didn't want to notice. Love makes us blind to the truths we're afraid to see. It took 3 months before he told me what he was. We were walking through the cemetery at midnight. He had a fascination with old tombstones, with the poetry of epitaphs, when he stopped beneath an ancient oak and turned to face me. He told me he'd lived for over 300 years, that he'd watched empires rise and fall, that he'd loved and lost more times than I could imagine. He told me he was a vampire, and that in all those centuries, he'd never met anyone who made him want to share eternity until he met me. I laughed at first. I thought it was some elaborate romantic gesture, some metaphor about the timelessness of love. But then he showed me. His eyes changed, becoming darker, almost black. His canines lengthened into points sharp enough to tear flesh, and when he took my hand and pressed it against his chest, I felt nothing, no heartbeat, no warmth, just cold, eternal silence. I should have run. Every instinct I had screamed at me to flee, but Dorian looked at me with such desperate longing, such profound loneliness, that I felt sorry for him. I told him I needed time to think, time to process what I'd learned. He gave me a week. I had a sister. Her name was Marina, and she was 2 years younger than me, beautiful, impulsive, and fiercely protective. We shared everything: secrets, dreams, clothes, even the tiny apartment near the university where we both lived. I told her about Dorian that same night. I expected her to tell me I was crazy, to laugh it off, to convince me it was all some elaborate trick. Instead, she sat quietly on her bed, fingers twisted in her lap, and asked me what I planned to do. I told her the truth. I told her I was terrified, that every logical part of my mind screamed that this was impossible, dangerous, wrong. But I also told her that I'd felt so alone for so long, and with Dorian, I felt like I'd finally found someone who understood the parts of me I'd always hidden. Marina held my hand that night and made me promise that I wouldn't make any decisions without talking to her first. She made me swear that whatever I chose, we would face it together. I promised. 3 days later, Dorian came to me with a different proposition. He told me he'd been thinking about what I'd said, about my hesitation, about the life I would be leaving behind. He understood, he said, why the choice was so difficult. But he also knew I would never be able to fully commit to eternity if it meant abandoning the person I loved most. He offered to transform Marina too. I remember the exact moment he said those words. We were standing on the bridge that crossed the river near our apartment, watching the water move beneath us in the moonlight. The city lights reflected on the surface like shattered glass, and for a moment, everything felt surreal, like I was watching my life from outside my own body. I told him no immediately. I told him Marina was too young, too full of life, too innocent to be dragged into this darkness. I told him I needed more time, that I couldn't make a decision like this for someone else. Dorian smiled that sad, ancient smile of his and told me he understood. He told me he would wait as long as I needed, that eternity meant nothing if I wasn't by his side. But he was lying. It happened on a Thursday night, 2 days before the week he'd given me was up. I came home late from the library, arms full of books, head full of poetry and half-formed thoughts about the future. The apartment was dark when I entered, which was strange because Marina was always home on Thursday nights. She had a standing dinner date with our mother, who lived across town. I called her name as I fumbled for the light switch, that small prickle of unease starting to crawl up my spine. The lights came on, and there he was, Dorian, sitting on our couch with Marina beside him. But something was wrong. Marina's skin was too pale, her eyes glassy and unfocused. And on her neck, just visible above the collar of her dress, were 2 perfect puncture wounds, still weeping blood. I dropped the books. The sound of them hitting the floor seemed impossibly loud in the silence. Dorian stood slowly, gracefully, and explained what he'd done. He told me that he'd been watching us, listening to our conversations, and he'd realized something. He'd realized that I would never choose eternity if it meant leaving Marina behind. So he'd made the choice for me. He'd transformed her. And now, he said with that beautiful, terrible smile, now we could all be together forever. Marina looked at me with eyes that were already changing, the brown I'd known my entire life darkening to something ancient and hungry. She tried to speak, but her voice came out as a whisper, weak and confused. She asked me what was happening to her, why she felt so cold, why her mouth tasted like copper and death. I wanted to go to her, to hold her, to tell her everything would be okay. But Dorian stood between us, and he explained very calmly, very reasonably, that the transformation had already begun. Marina would die within the hour if she didn't complete the change, and the only way to complete it was to drink human blood. He gave me an ultimatum then, standing in our little apartment surrounded by our books and our memories and our shattered future. He told me I could join them. He would transform me right there, and the 3 of us would become a family, bound by blood and eternity. Or I could refuse, and he would let Marina die, let her suffer through the transformation only to burn away into nothing when the sun rose. What choice did I have? What choice had he left me? I told him I would do it. I told him I would let him transform me if he saved Marina, if he taught her how to survive, if he promised to help her through the pain and confusion of what he'd made her become. He smiled then, genuinely smiled, and told me he'd known I would choose correctly. He told me he'd always known I would choose love over fear, family over self, and then he bit me. They describe the transformation in vampire stories as painful, violent, a tearing away of humanity in a flood of agony and blood. But that's not quite accurate. It was worse than pain. Pain you can fight against, brace yourself for, endure. This was something else entirely. Dorian's venom moved through my veins like liquid fire, burning away everything that made me alive. I could feel my heart slowing, each beat becoming harder, more labored, like it was fighting against the inevitable. My lungs struggled for air that my body no longer needed. My skin turned cold, the warmth of life leaching out through my pores. But the worst part, the part they never tell you, was the hunger. It started as an ache, deep in my chest where my dying heart struggled to beat. Then it spread, becoming a gnawing, desperate need that consumed every thought, every sensation. I became aware of sounds I'd never heard before. The rush of blood through veins, the flutter of heartbeats, the soft whisper of life all around me, taunting me with what I could no longer have. Marina was beside me through it all. I could hear her crying, could hear her begging Dorian to make it stop, to help me. But her voice sounded different now. Not the voice of my sister, but the voice of another predator, another creature of the night. When my heart finally stopped, when that last, stubborn beat faded into silence, I opened my eyes and saw the world in ways I never had before. Colors were sharper, almost painful in their intensity. I could see in the darkness as if it were day. And everywhere I looked, I saw life, pulsing and beating and begging to be consumed. Dorian brought me someone that first night. A homeless man he'd found sleeping in an alley, drunk enough that he wouldn't remember, wouldn't struggle too much. He held the man's wrist to my mouth and told me to drink, told me that this was what I was now, what I needed to survive. I wanted to refuse. I wanted to cling to the last shreds of my humanity, to prove that I was still the person I'd been just hours before. But the hunger was too strong, too overwhelming. When the blood touched my lips, warm and copper-sweet, something inside me broke. I drank and drank and drank until Dorian pulled me away, until the man collapsed unconscious on the floor. Marina watched me with those new dark eyes, and in them I saw the same horror I felt, horror at what we'd become, at what we'd been forced to do, at the eternity stretching out before us like a sentence without end. The first decade was survival. Dorian kept us close, teaching us the rules of our new existence, the laws that governed the vampire world. We learned to hunt without killing, to take only what we needed, to blend into human society without drawing attention. We learned to endure the daylight hours in the underground chambers Dorian had prepared, sleeping the dead sleep that claimed us when the sun rose. But most of all, we learned to lie. We lied to ourselves about what we were, what we'd lost, what we'd become. We pretended that this existence was a gift rather than a curse, that eternity was something to be grateful for rather than endured. Marina adapted faster than I did, maybe because she was younger, or maybe because the transformation had been her choice. Or at least, she'd convinced herself it had been. She stopped talking about the life we'd lost, the degrees we'd never finish, the careers we'd never have, the families we'd never raise. Instead, she focused on the power, the strength, the immortality that was now ours. And she focused on Dorian. I saw it happening slowly, like watching a flower bloom in reverse, petals folding in on themselves until there was nothing left but a closed bud. Marina started staying back when I went hunting, saying she wanted Dorian to teach her more advanced techniques. She started dressing differently, styling her hair the way he liked. She started laughing at his jokes with a brightness that felt forced, desperate. I told myself it didn't matter. Dorian was the one who'd transformed us, who'd trapped us in this existence. Whatever Marina felt for him was just another symptom of the horror he'd inflicted on us both. But then came the night I understood the truth. It was our 10th anniversary as vampires. Dorian had planned a celebration. He loved ceremonies, loved marking the passage of time as if it still meant something to creatures who would never die. He'd arranged for us to feed from particularly suitable victims, people whose blood was rich and clean, untainted by drugs or disease. I remember feeling uneasy all day, that prickling sensation at the back of my neck that told me something was wrong. Marina had been avoiding me for weeks, making excuses not to hunt together, not to talk. When I tried to ask her what was bothering her, she would smile that too bright smile and tell me everything was fine, wonderful, perfect. The celebration was held in the old mansion Dorian owned on the outskirts of the city, a place he called his sanctuary. Other vampires were there, members of his bloodline, ancient creatures who moved through the shadows like whispers. Marina arrived late, dressed in a gown of deep red silk that made her look like a ghost of old Hollywood glamour. She took her place beside Dorian, and I watched as he took her hand, lifted it to his lips, pressed a kiss to her pale knuckles. That's when I knew. After the formal ceremony, after the feeding, after the other vampires had melted back into the night, I confronted them. I found them in Dorian's private chambers, standing close together in the candlelight, his hands on her waist, her head tilted back to look up at him with something that might have been love or might have been obsession. With vampires, it was hard to tell the difference. I asked Marina what she was doing, my voice shaking with a fury I'd never felt before. I reminded her of what he'd done to us, how he'd stolen our lives, our choices, our future. I told her that whatever she thought she felt for him was just a twisted byproduct of the transformation, that she was confusing gratitude for love. Marina looked at me with those dark, empty eyes and told me I was wrong. She told me that Dorian had saved us, that he'd given us the greatest gift imaginable. She told me she'd been drawn to him from the first moment, that she'd listened to every conversation we'd had about him, that she'd been jealous of the attention he paid me. And then she said the words that shattered everything. She told me that she'd asked him to transform her. That night, I came home and found them together. She'd invited him in, had begged him to make her like him, had offered herself willingly. The transformation I'd seen as forced, as a trap, had been her choice all along. Dorian stood silent through this revelation, watching me with those ancient eyes. When I turned to him, demanding to know if this was true, he simply smiled and confirmed it. He told me that Marina had come to him days before, had told him she understood what he was offering, that she wanted it more than anything. He'd transformed her, knowing I would have no choice but to follow. I asked him then, my voice barely a whisper, if he'd ever loved me at all, or if I'd just been a means to an end, a way to secure Marina's loyalty by binding me to them both. Dorian's smile faded. He told me that love and possession were the same thing for creatures like us, that in 300 years, he'd learned that the only way to keep something forever was to own it completely. And in that moment, I understood that he'd never seen me as a person. I'd been a prize to be won, a possession to be claimed, a pet to be kept. I left that night. I walked out of Dorian's mansion and never went back. I left Marina there with him, left them to their twisted eternity together. Because I realized something as I stood in that candlelit chamber. My sister had betrayed me long before that night. She'd betrayed me with every lie, every smile, every moment she'd pretended we were in this together when really, she'd chosen him over me from the very beginning. For 30 years, I wandered. I moved from city to city, country to country, never staying long enough to form attachments, never allowing myself to care about anything or anyone. I learned to hunt alone, to survive without a bloodline, to exist in the shadows between vampire society and the human world. I heard rumors, occasionally, about Dorian and Marina. They'd become something of a power couple in certain vampire circles, beautiful and terrible, ruling over a nest of newly transformed vampires with an iron fist. Apparently, Dorian had developed a taste for creating new vampires, for building his own army of immortal children bound to him by blood and loyalty. I tried not to think about them. I tried to bury the memories of my human life, of the sister I'd lost, of the future that had been stolen from me. But vampires don't forget. We can't. Every memory stays crystal clear, perfect in its detail, playing over and over in our minds like a film reel that never stops. The loneliness was crushing. Humans lived and died around me, their lives flickering past like candle flames, too brief to matter, too fragile to invest in. And other vampires, most of them were like Dorian, seeing relationships as transactions, viewing others as possessions or pawns. I started to understand why so many ancient vampires went mad, why they chose to walk into the sun or stake themselves through the heart. Eternity without purpose, without connection, without hope. It wasn't a gift. It was the cruelest torture imaginable. Then I found Eravale. Eravale. Even now, saying the name sends a shiver through me. It's a city that exists in the spaces between human awareness, hidden by magic and time, visible only to those who know how to look. I stumbled upon it 40 years into my existence as a vampire, while I was traveling through Eastern Europe. I'd heard whispers of a place where vampires could live openly, where we didn't have to hide what we were, where the rules of the immortal world were different. The city revealed itself to me on a night when the moon was dark and the stars seemed to pulse with unusual brightness. One moment I was walking down a forest path, and the next, I was standing at the gates of a city that shouldn't have existed. Eravale was beautiful in a way that hurt. Gothic spires reached toward the sky like accusing fingers. Streets paved with stones worn smooth by centuries of footsteps wound through districts that seemed to shift and change depending on what time you looked at them. The architecture was a mix of every era imaginable. Roman columns next to medieval towers next to Baroque palaces, all existing together in impossible harmony. But the most striking thing about Eravale was its inhabitants. Vampires walked openly through the streets, no longer pretending to be human, no longer hiding their true nature. There were other creatures, too, beings I'd only heard about in myths and legends, living and working alongside the vampires as if this were the most natural thing in the world. I learned that Eravale existed outside normal time. A day in the city might be a week in the outside world, or a week might be just hours. It was a place where vampires could exist without the constant pressure of hiding, where they could build lives and societies that lasted for genuine centuries rather than the fragmented, nomadic existence most of us endured. I decided to stay. The first year in Arevale, I kept to myself. I found a small apartment in the older district, a place with high ceilings and windows that looked out over the twisting streets. I took a job at one of the many libraries that dotted the city. Arevale had a culture of scholarship, of preserving knowledge from throughout history. It was peaceful in a way. I cataloged ancient texts, helped researchers find obscure references, lost myself in the accumulated wisdom of millennia. For the first time since my transformation, I felt like I had a purpose beyond simply surviving. Then I met Theron Ashford. He came into the library on a Tuesday evening, though in Arevale, the days of the week were more suggestion than fact. He was looking for a specific text, a journal written by a vampire who'd lived through the fall of Rome. I helped him locate it in our restricted section, and as I handed him the fragile volume, our hands touched. The sensation was electric, not romantic, not sexual, but something deeper, a recognition of shared experience, of similar wounds. Theron was tall, with silver hair that fell to his shoulders, and eyes the color of storm clouds. He moved with the careful grace of someone who'd lived for a very long time, who'd learned to be gentle with a world that was so much more fragile than himself. We talked briefly that first night, just pleasantries, professional courtesy. But he came back the next evening, and the next, always with a new question, a new text to locate. Eventually, I realized he wasn't really interested in the books. He was interested in me. It took 3 months before he asked me to dinner, not to feed, but to one of Arevale's restaurants that served cuisine for vampires, dishes made with blood prepared in ways that were almost artistic. I accepted, surprising myself. Over that dinner, Theron told me his story. He was over 500 years old, transformed during the Renaissance by a vampire who'd seen potential in him. Unlike Dorian, Theron's maker had given him a choice, had explained exactly what immortality would mean, had allowed him to decide for himself. He'd said yes because he was dying of plague, because his family was already dead, because he had nothing left to lose. For centuries, he'd served on something called the Night Council, a governing body that oversaw vampire society, that created and enforced the laws that kept us hidden from human awareness. He'd seen empires rise and fall, watched humanity evolve from medieval barbarism to modern civilization. He'd loved and lost more times than he cared to count. But about 50 years ago, he'd left the council. He'd grown tired of politics, of power games, of the endless scheming and betrayal that defined vampire society at its highest levels. He'd come to Arevale to find peace, to study, to exist without agenda. When he asked about my history, I found myself telling him everything. About Dorian, about Marina, about the choice that wasn't a choice, about the betrayal that had shaped my entire existence as a vampire. I told him things I'd never spoken aloud, truths I'd barely admitted to myself. Theron listened without judgment, without pity. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he told me something I've never forgotten. He said that vampires often become trapped in the moment of their transformation, forever repeating the patterns established in those first days of immortal life. If you were transformed in anger, you carry that anger forward. If you were transformed in love, you chase that love eternally. And if you were transformed in betrayal, you see betrayal everywhere you look. He asked me if I wanted to stay trapped in that moment forever, or if I was ready to choose a different pattern. It was the first time anyone had suggested that I had a choice. Theron and I became partners, not lovers, not yet, but something deeper. Allies, friends. 2 wounded creatures learning to exist in the world without repeating the same painful patterns. He introduced me to his work, which I discovered was far more interesting than scholarly research. Theron ran what he called a liberation network, a system for rescuing newly transformed vampires from abusive makers, from bloodlines that treated their children as slaves or soldiers rather than individuals. The vampire world, I learned, was full of Dorians, creators who transformed humans without consent, who used their progeny for power or pleasure, who treated immortality as a gift they could bestow and therefore control. Most newly transformed vampires never escaped their makers, remaining bound by blood and manipulation for decades or centuries. Theron had made it his mission to break those bonds. We would identify vampires who wanted to escape their bloodlines, create safe passages for them out of their makers' territories, bring them to places like Ereval where they could learn to exist independently. It was dangerous work. Vampire law considered progeny to be the property of their makers, and helping them escape was technically theft. But Theron had the resources, the connections, and the skill to do it anyway. I threw myself into this work with a passion I hadn't felt since my transformation. Every vampire we freed felt like a small redemption, a tiny balancing of the scales. I couldn't undo what had been done to me, couldn't reclaim the life Dorian had stolen, but I could prevent the same thing from happening to others. We rescued dozens over the years. Young vampires, old vampires, vampires who'd been trapped in abusive bloodlines for centuries. Each one had a story, a moment when they'd realized that immortality in chains was worse than death. And slowly, without realizing it was happening, I began to heal. I can't pinpoint the exact moment I fell in love with Theron. It wasn't a sudden realization, not a dramatic revelation. It was gradual, like watching the sun rise. You don't notice the exact moment darkness becomes light. You just suddenly realize you can see. Maybe it was the night we rescued a young vampire named Elena from a maker who'd kept her locked in a basement for 30 years. Theron held her as she sobbed, this ancient, powerful creature reduced to comforting a broken child, and I saw the depth of his compassion, his endless capacity for care. Or maybe it was the evening he found me in the library, staring at an old photograph I'd kept from my human life, Marina and me, arm in arm, laughing at something I could no longer remember. He sat beside me in silence, not offering platitudes or comfort, just being present with my grief. When I finally spoke, telling him I didn't know how to stop missing her, he told me I didn't have to stop. He said grief was proof that love had existed, and that nothing, not even betrayal, could erase that. Or perhaps it was the morning I woke up in his apartment after we'd worked through the night planning a particularly dangerous rescue. I found him in the kitchen, attempting to make coffee even though neither of us could drink it, just because he remembered I'd loved the smell when I was human. It was such a small gesture, so tender and thoughtful, that I felt something crack open in my chest. Whatever the moment, whatever the cause, I found myself in love with him. And the terrifying part was that this love felt nothing like what I'd felt for Dorian. With Dorian, love had been desperate, consuming, a need that eclipsed everything else. It had been about what he could give me, how he made me feel, what he represented. With Theron, love was different. It was steady, patient, built on respect and understanding rather than passion and possession. He never tried to change me, never demanded I be anything other than what I was. He saw all my broken pieces and never tried to fix them. He just helped me learn to carry them with grace. I was afraid to tell him, afraid that acknowledging my feelings would somehow break the careful balance we'd built, would turn something good into something complicated, afraid that loving someone again would just give them power to hurt me. But Theron, being Theron, saw right through my silence. We were in the ruins of an old cathedral on the outskirts of Ereval, one of our favorite places to meet when planning operations. The ceiling had long since collapsed, leaving the space open to the night sky, and moonlight poured through the broken walls like silver water. We'd just finished coordinating the rescue of a group of 5 vampires from a particularly brutal maker in Vienna. The operation would be risky. The maker had connections to the Night Council, and taking his progeny would likely trigger a formal investigation. As we talked through the final details, I found myself watching Theron instead of focusing on the plans. The way he moved his hands when he explained something, the furrow between his brows when he was concentrating, the way his eyes softened when he talked about the vampires we would save. He caught me staring and fell silent, those storm gray eyes studying my face with an intensity that made me want to look away. Then he asked me, in that quiet, measured way of his, what I was thinking about. I could have lied, could have deflected, made a joke, changed the subject. Instead, I told him the truth. I told him I was thinking about how grateful I was to have found him, how working with him had given me something I thought I'd lost forever. Purpose, connection, hope. I told him that when I was with him, the weight of eternity felt bearable. That he'd taught me it was possible to build something good, even from the ruins of a destroyed life. And then, Before I could lose my courage, I told him I loved him. The silence that followed felt endless. Theron didn't move, didn't speak, just continued watching me with those ancient, knowing eyes. I started to panic, started to take it back, to apologize for making things awkward. But then he smiled, a real smile, warm and genuine and slightly sad. He told me he'd known for months. He said he'd seen it in the way I looked at him, the way I unconsciously moved closer when we were together, the way I'd started keeping small things of his in my apartment like talismans against loneliness. He told me he loved me too. But then he said something that made my heart, my metaphorical dead heart, sink. He told me he was afraid. Theron explained that in 500 years, he'd loved many times. Each time, he'd watched his lover eventually leave, either by choice or by death or by the slow erosion of feeling that came with immortality. He said that vampire relationships were fundamentally unstable because we changed so slowly that any compatibility eventually broke down, or we stayed too static and the relationship became stale. He told me he couldn't bear to love me and lose me, couldn't bear to add me to the list of people he mourned. I understood what he was saying. I'd felt the same fear, had my own scars from loving and losing, but I also knew something he didn't. I told him that I'd already lost everything once. I'd been betrayed by the person I loved most in the world, had my humanity stolen, had spent decades wandering in the wilderness of my own despair. I'd survived all of that, and if I could survive that, I could survive anything, even losing him. I told him that the alternative, never trying, never loving, never risking, that was the real death. That we could spend eternity protecting ourselves from pain, but we'd be living like corpses, just going through the motions of existence without ever truly being alive. I told him I'd rather have 10 years of real love and lose it than an eternity of careful, cautious safety. Theron looked at me for a long time. Then he reached out and took my hand, his cold fingers threading through mine. He told me that humans had a saying about falling in love, that it was like jumping off a cliff and hoping you could fly. He said that in 500 years, he'd forgotten how to jump, but he was willing to try. We had 5 years of peace, 5 years of partnership, of love, of building something meaningful together. We rescued more vampires, expanded the network, created safe houses throughout Europe and Asia. We spent quiet evenings in the library, reading side by side. We explored Erevalla's endless mysteries, discovering new districts that appeared and disappeared like dreams. It was the happiest I'd been since my transformation, maybe the happiest I'd been in my entire existence. But the past, as Theron once told me, is never truly past. It just waits in the shadows for the perfect moment to strike. The summons came on a winter evening when the sky above Erevalle had turned the color of old bruises. A messenger arrived at our door, a young vampire wearing the formal attire of the Night Council, carrying a sealed envelope marked with wax and blood. Theron opened it, his face growing progressively more tense as he read. When he finished, he handed it to me without a word. It was a formal summons to appear before the Night Council to testify at a trial. The accused was Dorian Blackwell, charged with violating the blood laws, specifically, with creating unauthorized vampires and using them for personal gain. The trial was to be held in 3 days. My testimony was required by order of the council, and Marina would be there too. I hadn't seen Marina in 65 years. 65 years since I'd walked out of Dorian's mansion, since I'd left her standing beside him in that candlelit chamber. I'd heard rumors, of course. It was impossible to exist in vampire society without hearing gossip. Marina and Dorian had become notorious, their bloodline growing into a small army. Apparently, it had finally attracted the wrong kind of attention. Theron tried to convince me not to go. He reminded me that council summons could be declined, that the political machinations of vampire society didn't have to be my concern. He argued that seeing Marina again would only reopen wounds that had finally started to heal. But I knew I had to go. Not for the council, not even for justice, though the idea of Dorian finally facing consequences for his actions did appeal to me. I had to go because I needed to see Marina one more time. I needed to know if the sister I'd loved was still in there somewhere, or if Dorian had consumed her completely. Theron, being Theron, refused to let me go alone. He used his former council connections to arrange for both of us to attend, ensuring we'd have at least some protection in what was sure to be a hostile environment. The trial was held in Rome, in an ancient chamber beneath the Colosseum that most humans didn't know existed. The room was circular, with stone benches rising in tiers around a central floor. The walls were carved with symbols from a dozen different vampire cultures, representing the different bloodlines and territories that made up the council's constituency. When we arrived, the chamber was already half full. Vampires from across the world had gathered to witness the trial, some out of genuine interest in justice, others because they enjoyed watching the powerful fall. I felt their eyes on me as we entered, felt the weight of their curiosity and speculation. In vampire society, I was a story, the scorned lover, the abandoned progeny, the one who'd walked away from Dorian Blackwell and survived. Theron stayed close beside me, his presence a steady anchor in the sea of hostile attention. He guided me to seats near the center, where we'd have a clear view of the proceedings. That's when I saw her. Marina was seated in the front row, reserved for family members of the accused. She wore a gown of midnight blue that made her skin look like porcelain, her dark hair swept up in an elaborate style that must have taken hours. She looked exactly as I remembered. Beautiful, elegant, untouched by time. But her eyes were different. Where once there had been warmth and mischief, now there was only a cold, glittering emptiness. She looked like a doll, perfect and lifeless. She saw me at the same moment I saw her. For a heartbeat, something flickered across her face, surprise, fear, maybe even longing. Then it was gone, replaced by that perfect, frozen mask. The council filed in with all the ceremony and gravitas that immortal beings loved. There were 7 of them, ancient vampires who'd survived for over 1,000 years each, who'd seen civilizations rise and fall, who held the power to enforce or ignore the laws that governed our kind. Theron had been one of them once. I saw the way they nodded to him, acknowledging his presence with the respect due to a former colleague. It gave me a small measure of comfort to know we had allies, however distant, in this room. Dorian was brought in last, flanked by guards. He was bound in chains made of silver, one of the few metals that could actually restrain a vampire, but even in captivity, he maintained that infuriating air of grace and confidence. He looked at me as he passed, and for just a moment, that beautiful face twisted into something ugly. The charges were read aloud by the council speaker. Dorian was accused of transforming over 50 humans in the past 60 years without proper authorization from the regional bloodline authorities. He was accused of using these progeny as soldiers and slaves, of creating an army that threatened the balance of power in Western Europe. He was accused of revealing vampire nature to humans who had not been approved for transformation, risking exposure of the entire vampire community. The evidence was overwhelming. Testimony from escaped members of his bloodline, documentation of unauthorized transformations, witness accounts of his abuses. One by one, vampires took the floor to speak against him, describing the horrors they'd endured under his rule. Then it was my turn. The speaker called my name, and I walked to the center of the chamber on legs that felt strangely weak. Every eye in the room was on me, but I forced myself to focus on the 7 council members seated in their high-backed chairs. They asked me to describe my transformation, to explain the circumstances under which Dorian had made me. I told them everything: the manipulation, the false courtship, Marina's forced transformation, the ultimatum he'd given me. I spoke clearly, factually, without emotion, because I knew that's what would be most effective. When I finished, there was silence in the chamber. Then one of the council members, an ancient woman with white hair and eyes like black diamonds, asked me a question that caught me off guard. She asked me if I'd loved Dorian. I was confused at first, unsure why this was relevant, but she explained that under vampire law, if I had consented to the transformation out of love, even under duress, then Dorian's actions toward me might not constitute a violation. I looked at her, at the 7 council members, at the room full of vampires waiting for my answer. Then I looked at Marina, still sitting in that front row, her hands folded in her lap, her face expressionless. I told them the truth. I told them I'd thought I loved him, but I'd really loved the lie he represented, the promise of being seen, of mattering to someone, of not being alone. I told them real love doesn't come with ultimatums and stolen choices. Real love doesn't require betrayal and manipulation to survive. I told them I'd learned what love actually looked like, and it was nothing like what Dorian had offered me. As I spoke, I watched Marina, and for the first time since I'd entered the chamber, I saw her mask crack. Her eyes filled with something that might have been tears, though vampires can't cry, and her perfect composure shattered just for a moment. The council thanked me for my testimony and dismissed me back to my seat. As I walked past Marina, she reached out and caught my hand, her cold fingers wrapping around mine in a desperate grip. She whispered my name, just my name, and in that single word, I heard decades of regret, of loneliness, of pain. Then the guards were there, pulling her back, reminding her that contact between witnesses and family members was not permitted. She released my hand and returned to her frozen composure, but I'd seen the truth beneath the surface. My sister was still in there somewhere, buried under 60 years of Dorian's influence. The council deliberated for 3 hours. In vampire terms, this was remarkably quick. Some trials lasted for weeks or months. The speed of their decision told me everything I needed to know about how damning the evidence had been. When they returned, the head of the council, the ancient woman who'd questioned me, pronounced the verdict. Dorian Blackwell was found guilty on all charges. His punishment was to be the final death, execution by fire, the one thing that could truly destroy a vampire. The sentence would be carried out immediately. I watched Dorian's face as the verdict was read. For the first time since I'd known him, he looked genuinely afraid. His composure cracked, and I saw the desperation beneath, not regret for what he'd done, but fear of losing the immortality he'd hoarded for so long. The guards began to move him toward the center of the chamber, where a pyre had been prepared. But before they could secure him, Dorian began to speak. He wasn't addressing the council or the assembled vampires. He was speaking to Marina and me, his voice ringing out through the stone chamber with terrible clarity. He told us he'd never loved either of us, that we'd been experiments to him, tests of his ability to create perfect progeny. He said Marina had been easy to manipulate. She'd wanted power and immortality so badly that a few whispered promises were all it took. He said I'd been more challenging, required more finesse, but breaking me had been even more satisfying because of it. He said the tragedy wasn't that he'd transformed us, but that we'd wasted our immortality on guilt and sentiment, instead of embracing the power it offered. And then, in his final moments, Dorian said something I'll never forget. He looked directly at me and told me that eternity doesn't forgive. He said it only repeats, that I would never escape the moment of my transformation, that I would carry his mark on my soul forever. He told me I would always be his creation, his possession, his proof that love was just another word for control. Then they lit the pyre. I won't describe what followed. Some things are too terrible to put into words, even in memory. But I will say this. Dorian Blackwell died as he'd lived, selfishly, cruelly, trying to wound others even as he burned. When it was over, when nothing remained but ash, the chamber slowly emptied. Vampires filed out in silence, heading back to their territories, their politics, their eternal games. Theron and I stayed, waiting, because I knew Marina would need to speak to me, and I knew she'd wait until we were alone. She found me in one of the antechambers, a small room lined with ancient texts that no one ever read. Theron had stepped away to give us privacy, though I knew he was close enough to help if I needed him. Marina stood in the doorway for a long moment, just looking at me. In the dim light, she looked younger somehow, more like the sister I'd known before everything went wrong. Then she spoke, and her voice was rough, broken in a way I'd never heard before. She told me she was sorry. Not the quick, easy apology of someone trying to escape guilt, but a deep, genuine acknowledgement of the harm she'd caused. She told me that every day for the past 65 years, she'd thought about that night, about the choice she'd made, about the sister she'd betrayed. She explained that it hadn't been love that drew her to Dorian. It had been fear. Fear of death, fear of being ordinary, fear of watching me build a life while she stayed trapped in my shadow. When Dorian had offered her immortality, she'd seen it as a way to finally matter, to finally be special. She hadn't realized until too late that she'd traded one form of invisibility for another. Living with Dorian, she told me, had been like drowning in slow motion. Every day he'd stripped away another piece of who she'd been, replacing it with what he wanted her to be. She'd become a doll, a trophy, a pretty thing he could show off to other vampires while he built his empire of broken progeny. She'd wanted to leave 1,000 times, but she'd been too afraid. Afraid of his retribution, afraid of being alone, afraid I'd never forgive her. Most of all, she'd been afraid that everything Dorian said about her was true, that she was weak, that she'd chosen this, that she deserved the prison she'd built around herself. As she spoke, I watched my sister, really watched her for the first time in decades. I saw the exhaustion in the way she held herself, the defeat in her eyes, the weight of guilt she'd been carrying alone. I could have held on to my anger. Could have told her she'd made her choice and had to live with the consequences. Could have walked away and left her to face eternity alone, the way she'd left me. But I remembered something Theron had told me. That vampires become trapped in the moment of their transformation, forever repeating the same patterns unless we consciously choose differently. Marina had been trapped in betrayal, repeating that first terrible choice over and over by staying with Dorian, by accepting his version of who she was. And I'd been trapped too, repeating my own pattern of abandonment, of closing myself off, of assuming that everyone I loved would eventually hurt me. We could both stay trapped, or we could choose something different. I asked Marina what she wanted now. Now that Dorian was gone, now that she was free, what did she actually want? She looked at me with those empty eyes and told me she didn't know. She said she'd spent so long being what Dorian wanted that she'd forgotten how to want things for herself. Then she asked me if there was any chance, any possibility, that we could rebuild what we'd lost. Not immediately, not easily, but eventually. She said she understood if I couldn't forgive her, couldn't trust her, couldn't stand to be near her. But she wanted me to know that she'd spend the rest of eternity trying to earn back what she'd thrown away. I told her I couldn't promise anything. I told her that trust was something that had to be rebuilt slowly, carefully, that there were no shortcuts through the grief and anger of the past 65 years. But I also told her I was willing to try. Because the alternative, carrying this hatred, this wound, this severed bond for the rest of eternity, that would be its own kind of prison. And I'd spent enough of my immortal life in chains. I told Marina she could come with us to Ereval if she wanted, that the city had space for people who needed to rediscover themselves. I told her about the work Theron and I did, about the vampires we helped escape from situations like the one she'd been in. I told her that maybe helping others could be a way to process what had happened to us. Marina accepted, and in her acceptance, I saw the first genuine spark of life I'd seen in her eyes in over half a century. The first year was difficult. Marina came to Erevale, but we didn't live together, didn't try to force a closeness that didn't exist. She found her own apartment across the city, started working with some of the vampires we'd rescued, slowly learning how to exist without Dorian's voice in her head telling her who to be. We met once a week for dinner, still not eating, but sharing blood in one of Erevale's establishments, talking about safe subjects, books, current events, the peculiar politics of the Eternal City. We avoided the past, avoided deep emotions, avoided anything that might shatter the fragile peace we were building. Theron was patient through all of this. He never pushed, never demanded I choose between my relationship with him and my reconnection with Marina. He understood that healing was not linear, that some wounds took centuries to close. Slowly, gradually, Marina and I began to rebuild our relationship. We started working together on rescues, her knowledge of Dorian's network proving invaluable in identifying other abusive makers. She had a gift for connecting with newly freed vampires, for helping them understand that the voices of their makers didn't define them. I watched her transform, not physically, but emotionally, spiritually. The empty doll gradually filled with life again. She started laughing, started expressing opinions, started discovering who she was beneath the layers of Dorian's conditioning. And as she healed, I realized something profound. I was healing too. Forgiving Marina didn't mean forgetting what had happened or pretending it didn't hurt. It meant acknowledging that we'd both been victims of Dorian's manipulation, that we'd both made choices under circumstances designed to give us no good options, that we'd both spent decades paying for those choices. It meant accepting that love, real love, doesn't keep score. It doesn't demand perfection. It doesn't abandon people when they're broken. 2 years after the trial, Marina came to me with a proposal. She wanted to expand our rescue network, to create a formal organization with safe houses throughout Europe. She'd been speaking with other survivors, other vampires who'd escaped abusive bloodlines, and they all said the same thing. They needed places to go, people who understood, a community of survivors. Together with Theron, we built it. We called it the Phoenix Network, because we were all creatures who'd burned and risen from the ashes. It became our purpose, our redemption, our way of taking the worst thing that had ever happened to us and transforming it into something that could help others. 5 years after Dorian's death, something happened that changed everything. It started as a feeling, a warmth in my chest that I dismissed as imagination. Vampires don't feel warmth. We're cold by nature, our bodies maintaining whatever temperature the ambient air provides. But this sensation persisted. It grew stronger over days, then weeks, spreading from my chest through my entire body. I started noticing other changes too. Colors seemed brighter, food smelled appealing even though I couldn't eat it. The sun's rays through windows no longer felt quite so hostile. I was terrified. I thought I was dying, if such a thing was even possible for vampires. I'd heard stories of ancient vampires who'd lived so long that their immortal bodies eventually gave out, crumbling into dust even without fire or stake. Theron took me to one of Aravel's oldest healers, a vampire who'd been transformed during the Crusades and had spent the past 800 years studying the peculiarities of our physiology. She examined me carefully, running tests that seemed more magical than medical, consulting texts written in languages that had been dead for millennia. When she finally gave us her assessment, she looked as shocked as I felt. She told me that I was experiencing something she'd only read about in myths and legends, the reawakening. In extremely rare cases, perhaps once in 1,000 years, a vampire who'd found genuine redemption, who'd transformed their existence from one of taking to one of giving, could experience a partial return of their humanity. Not enough to become fully human again, but enough to feel warmth, to have a heartbeat, to experience life in ways that immortals normally couldn't. She said it happened because I'd broken the pattern. Instead of staying trapped in the moment of my transformation, repeating the same cycles of betrayal and abandonment, I'd chosen differently. I'd chosen forgiveness, connection, love, and somehow, impossibly, my body was responding to that choice. The night I felt my heart beat again, I was with Theron in his apartment. We were reading side by side on his couch, a comfortable silence between us, when suddenly I felt it, a pulse, faint but unmistakable, echoing in my chest. I gasped, my hand flying to my heart. Theron immediately set down his book, concern flooding his face. He asked me what was wrong, if I was in pain. I took his hand and pressed it against my chest, right over my heart. We sat frozen like that, both of us barely breathing, or in my case, starting to breathe again, feeling that impossible rhythm. Thump, 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 slow, tentative, like a rusty engine trying to remember how to run. But it was there. Real. Undeniable. Theron's eyes filled with wonder, and something that looked almost like grief. He told me he'd never expected to feel this again, to press his hand against someone's chest and feel the proof of life beneath his palm. He told me it was the most beautiful thing he'd experienced in 500 years. We stayed like that for hours, just feeling my heart struggle back to life, beat by beat. And as we sat there, I realized something. The reawakening wasn't just physical, it was emotional, spiritual. For the first time since my transformation, I felt truly alive, not just existing, not just surviving, but genuinely, vitally alive. Marina came to see me the next day after she heard the news. She brought me flowers, something she remembered I'd loved when we were human. And when she hugged me, she felt the warmth of my skin and started crying tears she'd thought she'd never be able to shed again. She asked me if I thought it could happen to her too, if she'd done enough healing, enough growing, enough redemption to deserve the same gift. I told her I didn't know. The healer had said the reawakening was rare, unpredictable, governed by laws even vampires didn't fully understand. But I also told her that the point wasn't to earn some cosmic reward. The point was to live authentically, to build meaning from the ruins we'd been given, to choose love over hate, connection over isolation, forgiveness over vengeance. I told her that whether her heart ever beat again or not, she'd already accomplished the impossible. She'd reclaimed herself from someone who'd tried to own her completely. And sometimes, that was its own form of resurrection. Epilogue. The sky turns red tonight. As I finish recording this story, the sky above Erevalle has turned the most extraordinary shade of red. It happens sometimes in the Eternal City. The laws of physics and reality bend here, and the sky reflects the emotional landscape of its inhabitants. Red for transformation, red for endings and beginnings, red for blood that finally, after decades of coldness, has learned to flow warm again. I'm sitting in the library where I first met Theron, Marina beside me on one side, Theron on the other. The three of us have just finished planning our next rescue, a group of 5 vampires trapped in a bloodline in Prague who've asked for our help. My heart is beating steadily now, no longer tentative but strong and sure. I can feel warmth spreading through my veins, can smell the old books around us, can experience the world in ways I'd forgotten were possible. Theron reaches over and takes my hand, his fingers still cold against my warmth. He smiles at me, that rare, genuine smile that makes 500 years of existence worth living, and tells me that the impossible isn't really impossible. It's just what takes longest to achieve. Marina leans against my shoulder, and I can feel her starting to relax, starting to trust that this connection won't be torn away again. She whispers that she wishes our mother could have seen us now, could have known that eventually we found our way back to each other. I tell her that maybe, in some way, she can, that the dead watch over us with more patience than the living ever could. Outside, the red sky pulses like a heartbeat, my heartbeat, reminding me that even in a city outside of time, change is possible. Growth is possible. Forgiveness is possible. I've learned so much in 70 years of immortal existence. I've learned that eternity is not a gift or a curse. It's simply time. And what we do with that time defines us. I've learned that the people who hurt us most deeply are often hurt themselves, trapped in cycles they don't know how to break. I've learned that love isn't about possession or control. It's about seeing someone completely, accepting them fully, and choosing them anyway. Most importantly, I've learned that forgiveness doesn't mean condoning what was done to you. It means refusing to let those wounds define the rest of your existence. Dorian told me, in his final moments, that eternity only repeats, that I would never escape the moment of my transformation, that I would carry his mark forever. He was wrong. Eternity doesn't just repeat. It offers endless chances to begin again, to choose differently, to break the patterns that bind us. Every night is an opportunity to be someone new, to transform the pain of the past into the purpose of the present. Yes, I carry the mark of my transformation. The scars are still there, the memories still vivid and sharp, but they don't define me anymore. They're just part of my story, the dark chapter that makes the light chapters shine brighter. I've been blessed with something most vampires never experience. I've been given a second chance at life, even in death. I've found love that doesn't demand or destroy. I've rebuilt a relationship I thought was forever broken. I've discovered purpose in helping others escape the cages I once inhabited. And now, impossibly, miraculously, my heart beats again. Not human, not quite, but not entirely undead either. Something in between. Something new. As I sit here with the 2 people I love most in all the world, feeling warmth pulse through my veins, I think about all the newly transformed vampires out there who believe they're trapped forever in the worst moment of their existence. I think about all the creatures, human and otherwise, who believe that their wounds are permanent, that forgiveness is impossible, that change can't happen. I want them to know this. Not all immortality is eternal. Some wounds can heal, even if they take decades. Some patterns can be broken, even if they've repeated for centuries. Some hearts can beat again, even after they've been still for 70 years. The key is choice, always choice. To choose forgiveness when revenge would be easier. To choose connection when isolation feels safer. To choose growth when stagnation is more comfortable. To choose love when fear whispers that it's too dangerous. These choices don't guarantee a happy ending. They don't promise that your heart will literally beat again, that your sister will come back to you, that you'll find a partner who sees you as an equal rather than a possession. But they guarantee something more important. They guarantee that you're living rather than just existing, that you're participating in your own story rather than being trapped by someone else's narrative. Theron squeezes my hand, pulling me back to the present moment. He asks me what I'm thinking about, and I tell him the truth. I'm thinking about how grateful I am. For him, for Marina, for Araval, for the Phoenix Network, for every vampire we've helped, for every moment of connection that's made this existence worthwhile. I'm thinking about how the worst thing that ever happened to me, being transformed against my will, being betrayed by my sister, spending decades alone, eventually led me here, to this moment, to this life I've built from the ashes. I'm thinking that maybe Dorian was right about one thing. Eternity does repeat. But what he didn't understand is that we choose what gets repeated. We can repeat pain and betrayal and isolation, cycling through the same wounds forever. Or we can repeat love and forgiveness and connection, building on them until they become stronger than any darkness. I chose the light, Marina chose the light, Theron chose the light, and slowly, impossibly, we've built something luminous from the shadows. The sky above Araval pulses red, then begins to shift toward orange, then gold. Dawn is coming, not the deadly dawn that vampires fear, but something else, something new. I stand up, my sisters and Theron following, and together we walk toward the library's tall windows. We look out over the eternal city, at the impossible architecture, at the streets where time moves differently, at the safe haven we've helped build for broken creatures learning to be whole again. My heart beats steadily in my chest, a rhythm I once thought I'd lost forever. And I realize this is what resurrection looks like. Not a sudden miracle, not a dramatic transformation, but a slow, patient rebuilding of self, one choice at a time, one day at a time, one beat at a time. 70 years ago, I learned that even immortal creatures can bleed, not in body, but in soul. Tonight, I've learned something even more important. Even the dead can learn to live again. Not through magic or miracles, but through the hardest, most courageous choice any of us can make. The choice to forgive. Others, yes, but most importantly, ourselves. The choice to believe that no wound is truly permanent, that no pattern is truly unbreakable, that no heart is truly beyond saving, even mine, especially mine.